Well, welcome everybody. My name is Alex Wiseman. I'm going to do a formal introduction here in a second, but I wanted to just let you know that we are going to be letting people in sort of as they come. So you'll probably hear some dings maybe from the program as it lets folks in. I'm really excited to have you here. And let me start. So first of all, good afternoon, colleagues and guests. I'm delighted to extend a warm welcome to all of you as we gather for today's expanded virtual brown bag session. My name is Alex Wiseman, and I have the honor of representing both of ExpandED sponsoring entities. I represent the Texas Tech University Educational Leadership Policy Program as a professor, and the Center for International, sorry, we just talking about international stuff. The Center for Innovative Research in Change, Leadership, and Education, which we call CIRCLE, as its director. And I want to thank you all for joining us for the expanded virtual brown bag series today, featuring Dr. Brett Nachman. The expanded series is, I believe, a testament to CIRCLE's commitment to developing an environment of innovation, research, learning, and collaboration locally, regionally, nationally, and even internationally. I'll begin by asking you to please check out and share our website with your colleagues, your friends, and students. If you Google TTU Expanded, our website should be the first item in the results list. And I invite you to register for as many of our upcoming virtual brown bags as you can. We truly want to see you there. I'm very proud to share with you that we've gathered, I think, a remarkable ensemble of researchers, educators, and experts as expanded speakers coming from as close as right here at Texas Tech University, as well as from the University of Arkansas today and other highly esteemed institutions across the country. Our speakers' dedication to the pursuit of knowledge in the realms of educational practice, leadership, and policy is often really inspiring, and we're thrilled that they're willing to share their insights with all of us. So please check out who else is speaking in the coming months. Our next speaker is actually Dr. Gerald Latondra from Penn State University, who's going to be talking about teacher quality issues on a global scale. And register to attend as many or all of the sessions as you'd like. Before we transition to Dr. Nachman, let me just take a minute to share a little more about our virtual brown bag series in particular. So the aim of ExpandED is multifaceted. On the one hand, we're seeking to be a melting pot of ideas where it's a platform for students, faculty, and researchers to come together and delve into the critical issues that shape our educational landscape. And through this series, our speakers and panelists will bridge gaps, they'll foster dialogue, and they'll facilitate the cross-pollination of ideas that drives innovation and broadly transforms education policy and practice. We at the center and also in our program here, we firmly believe that education and policy are intrinsically linked, and the decisions we make today hold the power to shape the future of our society. So by sharing the latest research and cutting-edge practices, ExpandED empowers all of us to make informed choices, drive positive change, and inspire the educational leaders of tomorrow. But certainly ExpandED isn't just about information. We're not just talking at you. It's also about engagement. So as is appropriate in today's session, we invite all of you to participate actively. You can ask questions, you can challenge assumptions, you can collaborate with us in the pursuit of knowledge, because your perspectives and your experiences and your ideas are invaluable and they enrich our collective understanding. We just ask that while we're doing this today, there are a couple of things we'd like to say about how you interact. So if you could, while Dr. Nachman is speaking, feel free to type your questions and comments in the chat, and we can get to those during the Q&A time. And you can save your verbal questions and comments for the Q&A time that will come after Dr. Nachman has had a chance to present his research. And I think that'll provide us with a great platform for immediately getting your ideas out there, as well as a great exchange of ideas and information as part of this session. So thank you so much for being here. And without further ado, it is my distinct pleasure to introduce Dr. Brett Nachman as our expanded speaker today. Dr. Nachman is an assistant professor in adult and lifelong learning at the University of Arkansas. He brings a wealth of expertise, having recently completed a postdoc at NC State University's Belk Center for Community College Leadership and Research. Prior to this appointment, Dr. Nachman completed his doctorate at the University of Wisconsin-Madison in the Educational Leadership and Policy Analysis program. His scholarly pursuits are centered around crucial areas, including autism in higher education, issues of access and equity in community colleges, and fostering an inclusive LGBTQ+ campus climate. Dr. Nachman is at the forefront of impactful change in academia, as demonstrated by his role as the Director of Research for the College Autism Network, a nonprofit organization dedicated to serving autistic college students through advocacy, research, and training initiatives. His contributions to the field include more than 20 peer-reviewed journal articles, teaching experience at 4 prestigious universities, and a string of national awards and fellowships. Notably, Dr. Nachman recently secured a $500,000 Spencer Foundation Large Research Grant as a co-principal investigator for a national study on autistic college student success. Also, as an ECMC Foundation CTE Post-Secondary Research Fellow, that's a mouthful, by the way, Dr. Nachman delved into critical research on how community college career and technical education faculty engage with disabled students, showcasing his commitment to advancing accessibility in education. Recognized for his outstanding achievements, Dr. Nachman was honored with the K. Patricia Cross Future Leaders Award in 2020 by the Association for American Colleges and Universities. Additionally, he received the prestigious Paul P. Fiddler Research Grant from the National Resource Center for the First-Year Experience and Students in Transition. Please join me in providing a hearty welcome to Dr. Brett Rayna Nachman as he presents his research talk titled, "Asking for Anything is Tough, How Autistic College Students Reconcile Self-Advocacy." Thank you for being here.
Thank you, Alex. So glad to be with all of you here today. Hopefully, I'm going to be sharing my screen, and hopefully you can see everything as clearly as possible. That was a really nice presentation. I don't know what it's like to see your life flash in your eyes, but I felt like that's what it was in that intro, and that was really kind. Really glad to be joining you all. I know some of you are at Texas Tech, and I know I see some colleagues and friends across different spaces and countries as well. Really appreciate the invitation. So thank you to Dr. McNaughton and Dr. Wiseman and the community for having me here today at Texas Tech. So I want to use this as a space for us to talk about self-advocacy, to communicate about self-advocacy, specifically from the lens of autistic college students, but you might find that there's some really viable transferability across a number of different student communities and spaces. So what I'm going to be sharing with you all, if I can get my mouse to work, is a little overview of who I am and the background behind this, some context on autism and self-advocacy, my research on self-advocacy and the autism lens. I'm going to preview, Dr. Wiseman mentioned my research on autistic college student success, and we launched that study last year. That's wave 1, and we have some early findings to share with everybody. So kind of on the exclusive side, if you will, of seeing some early data there. And some of that data relates to self-advocacy. And we're going to conclude with some reflections, discussions, and Q&A. As mentioned, feel free to insert your questions in the chat. I'm happy to take that. And I also want to acknowledge that the funding behind some of the research that I'm sharing with you comes from some of the sources that Dr. Wiseman mentioned earlier. For the big autistic college student success study, you can see that a number of different avenues have supported this effort, notably Spencer Foundation, among others. So thank you. All right, let's get into the learning objectives for today, because this is our virtual classroom and we're all going to be learning, myself included. So what I want to really encourage today is that we try to dismantle misconceptions about autistic college students and embrace strengths, skills, and differences when thinking about this community. Also going to put some captions on. That I hope that you glean more context about research on autism in higher education, recognizing that it is a very expansive space, but also quite emergent. So there's a lot of different facets that I study, my colleagues study, and we're hoping to really illuminate those experiences that have often been overlooked in the higher education landscape. Finally, I'd like you to recognize that, autistic college students make sense of and demonstrate self-advocacy in a variety of different ways. And I want you to be able to articulate that and recognize how folks demonstrate that. Note about language, you'll notice that I use a lot of identity-first language where I'm saying autistic as opposed to person with autism. There are some variations in how people in the community describe this part of their identity. So what I try to encourage is that you just honor what the individuals prefer and note differences in examples. If you're unsure, use broad statements, but ultimately, it's often a very individual choice. But I'm going to start off with a question for all of you to kind of begin this interactive exchange. So I'd like you in the chat, if you feel comfortable, to note what are your general understandings of autistic college students' experiences, whether by virtue of people you've taught or worked with or observed. What are some of the initial words or ideas that come to mind when you think about the experiences that you've had? I'm going to give a moment to pause, and I'll chime in as I see some responses appear in the chat. I'll read some of these as they come in. So John is making reference to the notion of isolation, and that could be structurally imposed. It could also be sometimes the individual feeling inhibited and being able to engage with others in ways that feel comfortable given certain differences. So that's a very fair point there. What else is coming to mind for folks? Sam mentions that it can be very individualized. What is not a huge stressor for some can be a huge stressor for others, absolutely. And that stress may stem from social stimuli. It can stem from anxiety. It really runs the gamut. Alex mentions, I've heard people express expectations that many autistic students are highly intelligent. Absolutely. And of course, like any community, there's a spectrum, there's a continuum. And often what I like to say is there's a good degree of hyper interest in terms of students or autistic folks demonstrating their expertise in a particular area and perhaps being a content expert. So if we had a conversation about Disney today, which is my hyper interest, that would be where I would demonstrate my expertise, but also hopefully I can demonstrate it in other ways as well. John's mentioning that Ugo mentions that some students have been diagnosed, others have not, and they get different levels of support. Absolutely. Disclosure, diagnosis, lots of variation in terms of age. And we often see folks who identify as women and people of color are often diagnosed at later rates and not as frequently as their white male counterparts. There's a lot of inequities in terms of access to diagnoses and ultimately comfort with disclosure. Eleanor's mentioning the individualized nature of perceptions of autism and experiences. Yes, lots of differences. Kate is mentioning requiring clear instructions, keeping up with the framework. It can be difficult to be flexible when they have an expectation of protocols. And one of the transferable points that I really want to impart to everybody here today is this notion of transferability. So some of the inclusive teaching techniques that we might be utilizing to serve our autistic students are actually going to be serving everybody. So what I say is have a common class routine. It's not only going to benefit your folks who really value structure, but also perhaps everybody. Not that you have to be super rigid all the time, but if you have some common flow, that's going to be helpful. Jennifer mentions barriers related to securing accommodations and not wanting to disclose to professors and peers. Yes, and not all accommodations are really going to support the unique student. Great. All right, a little bit of context on who I am. Alex provided a really thorough intro, so I'm going to be pretty brief here, but I cover a variety of different issues. This slide comes from a study that I worked on that looked at the experiences of autistic folks who identify in the queer and trans communities. And I like to see that my work is kind of overlapping different communities, different contexts, and different perspectives, often different disciplines as well. So I come with a higher education background, of course, formally, but also with an intention to really illuminate the important roles of psychology and mental health in students' lives, disability studies, and thinking about some of the social structures that have been very ableist over time. And I realized I may not have disclosed it earlier. I'm autistic myself. Many of the folks in my community recognize that there's a huge personal significance to the work that I engage in, and I feel like that also aids my professional intent. I'm also director of research for College Autism Network, which is a nonprofit, as Alex mentioned there. I highly encourage you to check it out. We put on an annual College Autism Summit. We're going to Nashville next week with nearly 300 people, I believe, which will be our biggest event yet. And we provide opportunities for professionals, for students, for self-advocates, for community members to learn about how to better support our autistic college students. And Canvas is our monthly webinar series that I put on. And I see that one of our past presenters here is on the call. And we do a lot of different, we engage in a lot of different efforts to really serve our communities. So very, very quick overview of autism in case you're not familiar. Developmental disability that influences how individuals communicate and process information. You may have heard the word neurodiversity. It's part of this umbrella. So you can say an autistic individual is neurodivergent, whereas many autistic people are neurodiverse. Some nuances there with language. And autism presents differently with each individual, as noted in the chat. Some folks might be hypersensitive to noise or smell. Some folks might be extremely adept when it comes to organization and detail. And autism is a mix of strengths, and sometimes there are challenges. A lot of challenges are often by virtue of social structures that don't always allow the individual to thrive in ways that they would if perhaps there was some more accommodations and more re-envisioning of what inclusivity truly means. Diagnosis rates considerably vary. I mentioned this earlier in terms of who has access. Autism is often medicalized, but progressively we're looking at this with more of a strength-based approach, with adopting this social model of disability and a social justice approach too, which is very important. So the research question that's guiding this first main study that I'm going to focus our time on today it's a piece of my dissertation work, and this article is out. It's been out for about a year. It's called, the article itself is called "I Need Some Space: Autistic Community College Students and Self-Advocacy." So you'll see some overlap there. But what I was really curious about in my dissertation work was understanding the autistic community college student experience. These students are part of a college autism support program where there's specialized programming. And then for this specific piece, I was really curious about the role of self-advocacy. So you can see my research question is illustrated on the screen there in terms of attaining and practicing self-advocacy. So what I try to articulate is that self-advocacy, you're not always attaining it on your own. It's important to communicate your needs. Disabled students must often approach tasks more independently once they're in college. Perhaps there wasn't as much that they were demonstrating on their own prior to this point. And self-advocacy is a huge piece of these autism-specific college support programs. So a brief overview of the literature is that self-advocacy tells us that it's so important to understand what your rights are, to express and assert those rights through communicating your needs. And oftentimes this can translate into actions where folks are engaging in a movement. Sometimes it's this notion of the autism advocacy movement. There's the Autistic Self-Advocacy Network, or ASAN, that's had a huge presence and provides a lot of great resources and materials. Some movements are a bit more informal. You see the rise of autistic perspectives on social media. These are ways in which folks are demonstrating their needs and perspectives in ways that were not necessarily as possible 2 decades ago. So how do I approach how do I perceive self-advocacy is that an individual's personal characteristics, learned skills, and supports influence their capacity to engage in self-advocacy, ultimately through determining their priorities, taking appropriate actions, and utilizing resources that reflect their interests. Individuals are well positioned to engage in agentic behaviors. And this interpretation comes from Hagen and Donovan source here. So there's a lot of different factors that play a role here. And as I mentioned, there are a variety of different self-advocacy spaces for autistic folks, including ASAN. There's also Autism Network International. The framework guiding this particular study, I was really drawn by this conceptual framework of self-advocacy by Test and colleagues, which is really applied for the disabled folks more broadly, but I think it has a lot of applicability when we're thinking about the autistic community. And so what you see here are 4 tenets, if you will, of how folks demonstrate self-advocacy, how they perceive self-advocacy. So most foundationals, you have to understand yourself. What are your strengths? What are your learning styles? What are your responsibilities? How does your disability manifest? Also, what are your rights? So sometimes it's at a personal level, sometimes it's at a community level. There's also a communication element. How can you express your perspectives and ultimately self-advocate for yourself? Finally, there's a piece about leadership, right? So it's not only advocating for yourself on a large scale, maybe it's even advocating for your friend or colleague or peer. It can be where you're participating in a social organization like an ASAN. Maybe you're demonstrating perspectives on behalf of a whole group. What's really important to appreciate here is self-advocacy doesn't necessarily always manifest in a linear fashion or where all these different components happen in a particular order. But what Test and colleagues attest is that these are 4 key pillars in how self-advocacy presents itself. And for this particular study, I employed a case study. So we're thinking about the why and how the phenomenon, here the phenomenon being self-advocacy and how people experience it. So my study site, really cool. I love, so these are all pseudonyms. That's always my favorite part, is coming up with pseudonyms. And the college that I focused on for my work is called, in my words, Blue Moon Community College. So it's located in the suburb of a major American city, has a good degree of student enrollment. It serves a high number of transfer students, and it actually serves, has a number of bachelor's programs. So we increasingly are seeing more community colleges lean in this direction. The autism program at the centerpiece here is called Captains of Autism in Community College, because I like to view it as that they are kind of steering the ship of their own journey. It's more than a decade old now, and it serves approximately 140 autistic students at the time of my exploration. And that's pretty sizable. That's a very, very large autism program, particularly at a community college. And they feature workshops and courses, peer mentors. There's a lot of different opportunities for students, and their entry points are vastly different too. Some are recently diagnosed, others have long engaged with making sense of their autism identity. So you have to view it from the standpoint of that this is not a one-size-fits-all approach. There's a lot of variability in terms of who participates. For my study, this is the broader study, and also applied for this study, 13 autistic college students, 4 staff members in this program, 9 staff members across the university, across the college, and these included faculty and administrators, and then 9 people whose students nominated as important in their lives. Any of you who are qualitative scholars or are familiar with qualitative research, this is a lot of data, and particularly when there were multiple interviews with folks and other data sources, including documentation or document analysis, I should say, observations, surveys. It was a lot. This is a quick snapshot of the student sample, and you can see that they had different perspectives of how they viewed their autism. Many of them identified as having other disabilities, and certainly recognition that sexuality, gender identity is also illustrative of this larger theme that I'm seeing with subsequent work, that we're seeing a lot of folks who are in the autism community who are also part of the queer and trans communities as well. And you can see that this is, out of the 13 students, there are several who identify as multiracial. And this is a community and a city where there is a good amount of racial diversity. And actually what I want to really hone in on here is the snapshot that you're seeing, these 13 participants, is actually pretty illustrative of the program more generally in terms of what I was seeing and what I was hearing and finding out in terms of the demographic data. So I engaged in a variety of different coding approaches, deductive and inductive as well. I really wanted to honor this notion of rigor and that kind of seeping through all different parts of my work. So credibility. So I'm sending back interview summaries to students, not just the transcripts, but 1-2 page snapshots of what we discussed, making sure that my alignment or my interpretation was in alignment with theirs. They could edit, they could offer clarification. Lots of rich detail, really trying to illustrate the rationale of how I would use data. And I was very transparent with my participants on why I was engaging in this inquiry, what drew me in personally, and ultimately how this shaped the endeavor. So now let's get into the exciting stuff, the findings. So I'm going to highlight 3 main themes here that surfaced amongst our conversations. And this first one is this notion of students reflecting on self-advocacy upon transitioning into college. So as I mentioned, some of these folks were relatively newly diagnosed. Others were diagnosed when they were young children. So very different vantage points here. So self-advocacy also had different meanings. So some of them viewed their autistic traits as strengths. Some view them as challenges. But what does this really mean in terms of self-advocacy? Well, I think Dennis put it most appropriately in this quote, which you see highlighted on the bottom of the screen. Asking for anything is tough. And that's what I felt like would be really nice to encapsulate this presentation. Asking for anything is tough. And not that that necessarily applies to each individual, but it's this notion of students sometimes fear making requests about things because of past stigmatization, perhaps based on other salient identities in their lives where self-advocating is viewed as a weakness, where being vulnerable is a weakness. And that's where being in college, being in this program that had a very high focus on self-advocacy, as you'll see in the next theme, really changed their conceptions in terms of that the strength comes from being able to know what your needs are and to be able to share them and find the right resources. So I was going to say, Dennis was this, he was often trying to, find ways to connect with people and have people understand his traits. He really was honoring this notion of knowledge of self. He was very self-aware, and that came through further experience in the program and having a lot of, I think, self-awareness of his identity. Andrew, another participant, said that he tries to survive, in his words, without self-advocating. He said, I don't self-advocate because I think this person might have a lower opinion of me if they think my request is stupid. That totally illustrates this notion of fear of being stigmatized. Sarah Lyell said that she tries to handle everything by herself. So where might changes unfold? Well, these students went through courses in the program. They were credit-bearing courses. One of them focused on self-advocacy and how you can self-advocate for yourself, and where they were learning that their strengths, what their strengths are and how they can bolster their career intentions, how you can translate this to other spaces. But here's something transferable here. What we're talking about with self-advocacy, it's not just limited to our autistic college students. This is all college students. Everybody's entry points are completely different in terms of what you've had to go through in your K-12 experiences or as a child, in terms of what resources you needed to attain, were resources provided for you, were you making the best of a challenging situation. Folks recognize that there's a lot of different dimensions to this, whether it be financial, health, comfort, academics. There's so many different layers. So some of the topics here we can see are also meaningful and applicable outside of the autism community as well. So again, students were sometimes resisting help-seeking behaviors, but they were taking a self-advocacy course. And I'm going to take a sip because my mouth is dry. So you can read this quote for a moment. It's a problem. If I'm talking for a while, my mouth is going to get very dry. Excuse me. So they were taking a specific course on self-advocacy. They were realizing their rights and responsibilities within this course. So John, he was saying that he had learned how to stand up for himself, how to present himself, how to reach out for help, and how not to be shy about reaching out for help to people who better know what they're doing, in his words. Really encouraging. They were completing a community advocacy project where they were learning about what self-advocacy looks like on a broader scale outside of just themselves. Excuse me. And they were also determining how to stand up for themselves and reach out for assistance. So what I love about this course, and I feel like this is where a lot of first-year experience courses and other spaces can be leveraged to have more intentional programming about self-advocacy. This was a kind of a unique situation, but embedding self-advocacy in other spaces helps students recognize that they have more strength and more power than they realize. But there has to be a lot of self-awareness. There also has to be resource attainment, and there also has to be open-minded individuals in their spaces that they can connect with. Role-playing is a very viable approach in the autism community as a way of making sense of situations, to rehearse phrases, to think of strategies. They were utilizing that firsthand in this course. So let me find the participant. John, again, was saying that he was realizing that he was not afraid to ask for help. And I also want to say that it's so important to I'm losing my thought because I'm so excited about presenting these findings yet again. But what this program was really emphasizing is that demonstrating agency does not necessarily limit itself to college contexts, and that's where this next theme comes to surface. Let me just take one sip. Apparently, I just have a very dry throat right now. So students were realizing in this course and in other spaces that self-advocacy has a lot of transferability. And one technique that this program utilizes that I think has a lot of versatility is this notion of collaborative problem solving. So this is where you're communicating with a colleague, with a mentor, with a faculty member, with a peer, where you're going to anticipate, practice, and embrace potential situations that can emerge. This is where the solution isn't provided to you from someone who's higher up than you in their career or experience, but you're thinking through things together. Very transferable. So Finn was the type of individual where he would often follow the crowd. He didn't always feel comfortable doing things or wasn't always interested, but he didn't want to make a scene. He didn't want to make a fuss. So he's like, I'll just kind of go with it. But through being in these self-advocacy spaces, he said, you can simply come up with something as forceful as you want it to be. So basically he would tell his peers like, yeah, I'm not comfortable with this, or I'm not interested, or even be more generic than that. And he didn't have to explain himself. But in those ways, he was advocating for himself because he was saying, okay, you know what, not for me. But he didn't need to elaborate. If he wanted to, he could, but he was advocating for himself. And for him, that was growth. It's all about this mix of using assertiveness, negotiation, and persuasive techniques to employ self-advocacy. And that's going to look completely different from one individual to the next, because again, we're all very different. And also too, there are different layers to this in terms of what students were experiencing, right? Some of them came from households where they perhaps didn't always feel like they had as much power. So perhaps they were going to be a bit more inhibited in familial spaces versus on college campuses. So what I'd like to demonstrate in thinking back to this work, so this autism program, Legacy CACC, can be very helpful in providing awareness of how to engage in agentic behaviors. We are seeing a huge rise of these college autism programs. My colleagues and I have really been on the forefront of trying to catalog these across the country. We see that, at least by virtue of our definitions, there are more than 100 of these programs across colleges and universities nationwide. Again, these are programs housed within an individual institution. There's often only 1 or 2 staff members, but there are also centers on campus that really emphasize autism. I know you all have the Burkhardt Center there at Texas Tech, and there are others that are looking at autism across the lifespan and across different age ranges, really trying to leverage how we support our autistic college students. It's such a viable mechanism because this is a pivotal time where folks are figuring out, like all college students, what is my purpose? What am I hoping to do beyond college? And in what ways am I going to really be contributing to the world and also contributing to my own self-development? We all have a really important responsibility in facilitating that, even though there are only 100 of these programs and some centers and some spaces, and sometimes it feels very scattered. Everybody has a responsibility and everybody can play a role, which I'll talk about in the subsequent slide. What we also see from this work is that obtaining the right tools can make all the difference for students. So yes, they were very fortunate to be in a course that emphasized self-advocacy, but in addition to that, they were around people who were extremely knowledgeable about how to demonstrate that, how to rehearse it, how to practice it, how to make sense of it, how to be aware of themselves. Over time, autistic people may gain further self-advocacy skills that map onto the test and colleagues framework. So we saw some illustrations of knowledge of self and knowledge of rights. One of my favorite examples from this whole study was Dennis, I believe. Dennis was talking about how he advocated for his peers. So he said that he was kind of recalling the situation where he was sitting in a classroom and he noticed his peer, his classmate, was a scoocher. He just scooched around in his seat a lot. But based on how the classroom was laid out, he didn't have a lot of scooching space. So what did Dennis do? He kind of moved some of the desks away so that his peer had more scooching space. And in that way, he was advocating for him. He was making a more comfortable environment for him. That's an illustration of leadership. It may seem very small scale and to some maybe even trivial. That's the notion of being able to consider what others need for their own success and for their own comfort. I also want to articulate how building rapport with staff can be very helpful in advocating for oneself. So some implications I'd like to impart on everybody. Discussions of dependency among parents and ASP or autism specific college support program staff need to happen, right? We see often these parental orientations in some spaces, or where there's family day or whatever. We need more intentional dialogues about what dependency looks like. Oftentimes and this connects back to some other work as part of this larger study about parental involvement, parents are crucial figures in many autistic college students' lives, not all, but many. And often there's a lot of dependency that students feel on their parents because they haven't handled as much for themselves until they enter college, and then challenges unfold when there's disconnects and not knowing how to handle certain processes. We see this among the larger, first-year population too. All that to say, through having more intentional conversations, being more transparent about figuring out what that balance looks like, it helps students figure out how they can self-advocate better for themselves, and how parents can also kind of take a step back. Asking for help is not necessarily bad. What we see here is it's important for students to know who to ask for, who to ask who can be resources, but also when and where and for what reasons. That self-awareness and knowing what steps they can take. But we cannot put that onus on the students that they should all figure that out. We need to provide them with that foundation, and that's where college staff and parents and faculty in tandem all can have more collective conversations toward that end. I feel like institutional research offices on campuses could be thinking about, well, maybe there's value in incorporating campus-wide survey questions about self-advocacy, because that may also illuminate what resources the campus can be more intentional about in terms of leading students to utilize certain offices, whether it's tutoring or counseling or even finding campus organizations. that would be really invaluable. And of course, some campuses may employ some iteration of this, but we need to really elevate that. I also think, as I mentioned earlier, first-year experience courses would very much benefit from more explicit curricula on self-advocacy for all students. And I think campus staff would benefit from more consistent training about working with autistic college students. That's a no-brainer. Like, I mean, it's easy to say, oh, more training, everybody's more adept. You all attend a webinar, you're more adept. And of course, consistent exposure is helpful, but it's also thinking about how do we extend these conversations outside of one-time efforts or a training. It's through having a chat with a colleague, like, oh yeah, like I had this situation unfold with a student. How did you handle this? That makes a difference. So I'm going to conclude with some final slides related to the really exciting study. The last study was very exciting. This is a much bigger scale study. This is we call this Project Pieces. It stands for Post-Secondary Education, Autistic Collegians' Experiences of Success. We launched this last year with some funding from the FAR Fund, the First Center for Autism and Innovation at Vanderbilt, a little bit from Arkansas too. And then last year we got, last March, we got a $500,000 grant from the Spencer Foundation to expand this study. Last year, we had 430 participants from around the country. These are undergraduate autistic college students. Fill out the survey about how they define college student success, what supports their success, etc. 430. Some of you might be quant folks. Some of you may be folks who have engaged with large data sets. 430 at first glance may feel like, oh, that's cute. This is actually the largest study of autistic college students in the US that's exclusively focused on autism to date. And we're super excited by that, but because what this means is our insights about autism are not necessarily relegated to one institution or one program. We're understanding things from a collective standpoint and across various domains of success. So not just traditional measures like academics, but we're also exploring the role of students and their multifaceted identities, their mental health, engagement with different members of their communities, including peers and faculty and friends. We're also thinking about employment. This is a very comprehensive effort, and it's something that we are extremely excited about, very proud of. And ultimately, this is a longitudinal effort. So we have 1 year of data. We have a grant for the next 3 years, and we're hoping to continue to build on this. We are last year was a survey. This year, we are launching it this week. So I encourage you to check out our website for more information. We are not only distributing surveys this year, but also conducting interviews and photo elicitation activities to understand various ways in which individuals communicate success. Ultimately, we hope to build a large longitudinal and comprehensive data set of autistic undergraduate college students in the US. And with the right resources, we intend to be in a space where we make this data available to emergent and even well-established researchers to draw on particular data points to serve their specific inquiries. So if you're a scholar interested in the role of how autistic college students make sense of their employment pathways and they're currently community college students, we would have that data. Again, this is going to require a big infrastructure, but we're building that foundation, and very excitedly so. As it pertains to this conversation about self-advocacy, though, I'm going to share with you a few different data points. I do want to illustrate, though, our sample, at least among our wave one, which was last year, very fascinating. We had 2/3 of students identify somewhere on the queer spectrum. 1/3 of all students identified as part of the transgender community. We have about just over a quarter of students identified as students of color or multiracial. 1/3 of our students have a self-diagnosis of autism. We want to recognize that too. It's not always, not all studies always account for those with self-diagnoses because of this traditional notion of that you need a formal diagnosis to get accommodations or to receive support. There's a very sizable base of individuals who are self-diagnosed. to a question we had about identification. Do you view your autism as a disability? You can see that about half said yes, a third said sometimes or depends, and then 12% said no. But self-advocacy, we're going to go back to that. So we had a number of different scales asking about success, and one of them was about definitions of success. Self-advocacy was the third most important factor that students noted. Very, very important. Now, interestingly, this does not manifest as saliently in their open-ended responses, but what does present itself still reveals some important transferable themes. So we had an open-ended question about how do you define success? Completely open-ended. We positioned these questions before the Likert scale items so as not to lead them down certain directions. So participant 407 said that success meant to develop the ability to self-advocate and move through the world with confidence, to strengthen my sense of self and start leading my life organically. Participant 14 said being successful in college means being in class every day, doing assignments and homework fully and completely, and advocating for yourself. So a couple of examples there. We also asked, what are the most helpful factors in feeling successful? Well, again, that's going to be very varied. And I'm just pulling out a few examples related to self-advocacy, but we saw them all across the board. 158 said the Disability Resource Center, they helped me advocate for myself and my needs. They have provided me with accommodations that have helped me maintain safe mental health while being able to be successful in classes. 275, advocating for myself, making my voice heard about my needs, never backing down, even when advisors, professors, mentors pushed me to take the easy way out. So really, really telling that, if provided with the right resources and knowing the right people, students can leverage self-advocacy. But what would help their success? Here are a few examples. Participant 23 said, receiving services to allow me to be independent and help me live on my own, as well as help finding jobs and internships and having an advocate. That notion of having a one-on-one support, an individual who they can go to, who can provide them with resources so they can better advocate for themselves. 105 said, I really wanted to go to a support with a specific autism support program like X institution. However, my school doesn't have any supports in place. There's not even a club for neurodivergent students. Structured support like this, that encompasses everything from social support to help advocating for yourself would be immensely helpful, because it would let me feel like people are there for me. And participant 252 said better accommodations that I don't have to advocate for. So all this information is informative because it enables us to relay recommendations to a variety of different practitioners on college campuses on what can be implemented, whether it's bigger scale or smaller scale, and figuring out how is that realistic. So we're going to wrap up, but I'm going to pose a reflection question for you. So I want you to think about your role on a college campus or connected to college students or autistic folks more generally. What are some ways in which you feel like you could better support autistic college students' self-advocacy? So please feel free to share in the chat.
Thank you so much, Dr. Nachman. That was a wonderful presentation. I learned a lot about self-advocacy and autism more broadly as well. This is a great opportunity for folks to ask questions or make comments if you'd like. You are welcome to unmute and ask it. John?
Brett, there's Hugo. Good to see you. Great presentation. So, one of the challenges that I've seen when I was in LA and in the Vegas area is that there's a large foster youth communities. And from your presentation, parents play a large role in helping students with autism kind of develop this self-advocacy and self-efficacy, right? So what happens when you have youth who are going through the foster system and from home to home, and once they age out and they're trying to, have opportunities to participate in some kind of post-secondary education that may not have the skills that we see are important to navigate higher education. Any thoughts on that, or any students or participants that went through the foster system that can shed light into that?
I think that's a great point, Ugo. You know, it's in my so for my dissertation work, like I feel like I scoured the literature on anything you could imagine with autistic college students, and I continue to. I will tell you, in my exploration, and not to say it's been completely exhaustive, there's been little to no conversations on foster youth. But I think what that also illuminates is we're not hearing their stories yet, right? Of course, that exists. And I would also contend too that I would imagine, and I'm not saying that I have all the answers here, but I would imagine that there's huge underdiagnoses in the foster youth community as well. And what we see with so many minoritized communities, autistic communities in college, is that often college will be that space if they have the right resources to obtain a diagnosis. Consequently, I think that notion of resource attainment and being able to find ways to support needs are going to be vastly difficult. But I imagine and hope that through our next wave of data collection this year, that we can be able to gather further perspective. I also hope that via interviews we'll gather that. What we're really trying to engage in with our data collection efforts is not only reaching out to specific spaces like autism programs to get participants. I should mention, most of the ways in which we have gathered folks to be part of this is via more organic means, via social media, via various networks and connections. We're reaching out to disability service offices, but recognizing not everybody has a diagnosis. We're trying to think of a collection of all these different means to really capture, to gather perspectives across the board. And I think foster youth is one of those additional identities and communities that I have not seen in a lot of autism spaces, but I imagine as more time passes, we'll be able to illuminate that, because I think there's, in terms of self-advocacy, boy, I mean, that's a space where, think of how often how resilient and how resourceful folks with those experiences navigate the world. So looking at it from an autistic lens, I think would be really nuanced and fascinating. I wish I had some context or clarity. I think that's such an emergent space.
Yeah, and just to kind of just do a quick follow-up to that is John and I had done a study in international centers on a project we did a few years ago. We asked about professional staff to deal with many of the mental stress and various issues that international students were having as they transition to a new country, a new culture. And all these center directors are saying, well, we really don't have any professional staff. Whenever they're dealing with stuff, we try to deal with them as best we can, but we may recommend off-campus services. But these are at major research universities for the most part. And now if you're talking about community colleges, it's like we know that many community colleges in large metropolitan areas have counselor to student ratio of over 1,000 to 1, right? And so that's usually on academic issues, but very little professional staff to deal with some of the other things that community college students are dealing with in addition to academics. That how does the community college even attempt to try to support students that have all these identities and layers that they're bringing onto campus and not even having the resources available. So anyway, that was just another, but I appreciate your response. Thank you, Brett.
Yeah, thank you, Hugo. Good to see you. And I'll say that I think that's the exciting thing about this work is, and because you bring out the community college part, my colleague and I were looking earlier at data from wave one of our community college students. And boy, like we definitely saw some transferable aspects in terms of resource attainment. So access to good transportation, financial support, right? As fellow community college scholars, we recognize the prevalence of that, when we also realize the difficulties if that present itself if these resources are not only accessible, but also not apparent and harder to be able to tap into. Yeah, other questions or perspectives?
Dr. Nachman, there is a question in the chat from Kate O'Mara, which I'm happy to read out loud, or Kate, you can unmute and ask yourself if you'd like, or give Kate a chance. Okay. She says, do you find that students with siblings are supportive? Are autistic too? I'm not sure what that means. Is family support at the college level more helpful, or should parents allow the student to struggle and use the campus supports only?
Oh, that's a good question, Kate. You know, there is some scholarship on siblings of autistic individuals and how they navigate being a resource and friend for their sibling. I haven't seen as much of it at the college in the higher ed literature, but it does exist. What else? What my understandings include that yes, family support at the college level can be helpful, but it's all about how and when and under what circumstances that's used. So a separate paper that I've been working on relates to parental involvement, and that manifests to some degree with this work. But what I really want to be able to demonstrate is that yes, and Eleanor, yes, your research is in this space. Yes, thanks, Eleanor. Eleanor was one of our great College Autism Network presenters earlier in the year. What we're finding is that parental involvement has its utility, but often the challenge is those boundaries and structures and limits are not necessarily established going into college, and consequently, when some students arrive in college, they're either relying too heavily on their parents, or the parents are being too involved where they're interfering in spaces that are inhibiting their students to grow independently. And I'm not necessarily implying that it's completely dichotomous where it's either good or bad. The problem is that there's not always enough transparency and conversation amongst parents and their children prior to college. And consequently, there's a lot of growing pains that emerge once the student is needing to talk with a counselor for the first time, or meet with an advisor and figure out classes, and they don't know what to do. And I mean, I can speak about this from personal experience. I was in a space where I relied very much on my parents prior to college, and even in starting college, I would sometimes get help with how to frame an email because I wanted to make sure that my tone was coming across appropriately, or how to anticipate communicating with a faculty member. The challenge becomes when it inhibits the student from making their own decisions and being able to share their own perspectives and take the steps gradually to develop that agency. So it's very nuanced, it's very complex, and even furthermore, in communities where autism is further stigmatized, and maybe that individual has had to be even further agentic from a young age because their parents didn't even want to acknowledge their diagnosis. We have on a separate study now part of where we're seeing a lot of that in certain spaces.
We are kind of at the end of our hour. I just wanted to give anyone who has a last question, if you'd like to ask or a comment. Jen?
Yeah, I had one quick question that we could probably talk about via email after, and then one question you can probably address with the group. My first being that I've supported a couple different first-year programs, whether it be for first-year students or for transfer students. And I really appreciated how you talked about how these types of programs can be more intentional about embedding lessons about self-advocacy. So I was just curious if there's like any suggestions or areas of the curriculum that are especially that could be used to leverage these types of lessons. And so that could probably potentially be something, if you have any resources of that I could talk to you offline. But then my second question was regarding, what do you believe the role of high schools and transition planning is in helping students develop these types of self-advocacy skills? Obviously, it would differ because you're talking about students who may have a late diagnosis. But yeah.
Yeah, great questions, Jennifer. Good to see you. As far as the first question, so I think what I really try to think about with those first year experience courses, not currently teaching one, but I can speak from the experience of engaging with the scholarship, having taught in the past, and my colleagues. What I see a lot of, certainly in that curriculum, is an emphasis on what are the different resources on campus. And there's so much often where the instructor brings in representatives from those specific spaces to familiarize students. And sometimes there's little field trips to go to those offices or spaces, which I think is very viable. I think that early acquainting with resources is helpful, but I think there also can be, in concert with that, operationalizing what resource attainment is, and then engaging students in activities or self-reflections to think about, what do you do when you're unsure about how to get help? Who do you turn to? Like having students like list these out in some format, and then having maybe small group conversations and figuring out what resources other students employ. Again, that notion of resource sharing, one little step doesn't solve the issue, but I think it works toward that notion of naming what self-advocacy is across different settings. As far as the notion about transition planning, I think that's where there just need, I mean, it's easier said than done. Greater partnerships between high schools and colleges. I feel like often community colleges are very well suited in terms of just being very embedded in the community, but you also have community colleges serving adult learners, non-traditional learners, not necessarily strictly focused on those straight out of high school. I feel like, and that's what we really try to do with College Autism Network, not to try to put us up, but we're really focusing on how are folks in our spaces, whether they're disability service office professionals or counselors or high school advisors, how are we having conversations across spaces, across countries, across different spaces? It sounds so simple and sounds so trite, and I'm not trying to belittle it, but I really think conversations can make such a difference. That self-advocacy, here's a time, reaching out, sending an email to someone you don't know and saying, let's have a conversation. I'm not trying to make it seem like it's as easy as that, but I feel like that what I've seen in the spaces I've been a part of, and realizing that's not representative, but if you don't make the effort, you never know what happens. And I feel like, and we all know this in higher ed, sometimes our spaces are so bifurcated and we don't even know the people in the other office down the hall. We all can take those little steps. And I think in terms of that divide with high schools and colleges and transition planning, the challenge is that we're talking to each other and not so much with, and we need to create more spaces where there can be those partnerships. So not a simple answer, simple solution, but I think it's a reminder for all of us that there's also that transferable point for all the work that we do. And that's why maybe as a wrap up, Alex, like that's why I also appreciate the space to engage with all of you. So often, or many times I talk about my autism work in autism specific spaces, and that has its value, and there's a lot of shared understanding, but similarly, there's a lot of value in being able to cross different spaces and to engage with higher ed scholars or education scholars where perhaps this is more of an entry point to autism. All of these make a difference collectively in terms of opening our eyes and perhaps building connections.
Thank you, Dr. Nachman. That was a great summary and sort of transition for us. I want to thank everyone for being here, for the wonderful questions that you've asked. I think there's probably a lot more. Fortunately, Dr. Nachman had his email and his Twitter handle up. So if you want to get in touch with him, please do that. Dr. Nachman, thank you so much. For anyone who wants to view this later, it has been recorded. It will be available on our ExpandED website. So you can just go there probably tomorrow and see a copy of it up there. Thank you, everyone. Have a great rest of your day. Come join us at the next ExpandED.